it to the cloud. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up a Google Doc, right? Just for the sake of demonstration. So what you have, and by the way, for your introduction, what you have is until midnight to submit that. One thing that I did is I extended it a week, but I'm also going to give you till midnight to submit it so that if there is any final questions after this recording, you can ask them and get additional feedback. I know some people popped in for the drop-in hours. I appreciated that very much. And if you didn't drop in, that try and drop in the future because that'll give you opportunity to ask questions. Also, feel free to drop in when I do the video recordings. That's fine too. So where we're at in this game called the research paper is the method section. Now, just a reminder, when we do this, there are levels of heading, right? So a level 1 heading is bold and centered. So we're going to write method and we're going to bold that, right? And then I'm ignoring the spacing for the time being. There are 4 parts to a method section. There's your design subsection. There are your participants. There are your instruments. And then there are your procedures. So what I'm going to cover today are what should be in each of these subsections, right? So for your design section, you want to describe how you're measuring your variables. Now, just as a demo, can I have one person on the call share one of their research questions? And anyone who feels comfortable just stating one of your research questions. It should be at the bottom of your intro. Worst case scenario, I'll just call on someone. All right. Angie, what's one of the research questions you have?
Just give me 1 second so I can pull it up.
Sure.
We asked whether or not one could be affected by would their sleep schedule be affected by COVID-19's quarantine?
Okay, so you want to measure, what are you measuring? You're measuring sleep, right? So
we're measuring sleep patterns.
Sleep patterns, right? So how will you be measuring sleep patterns? If you have an instrument, you're going to want to say, actually, in this part, you're going to want to say the dependent variable in this study is or are, and I should put in the dependent variable or variables in the study are sleep patterns. Give me another one. Another
was the anxiety or depression levels increased by the quarantine caused by COVID-19?
Anxiety and depression, right? So these are your dependent variable. Now, you're going to need to group your participants into various categories, right? So you're measuring the effect of the pandemic on sleep, anxiety, and depression, right? So that's what you're measuring. is there a variable that you're either manipulating or grouping your participants by? So this could be, you could be looking at ethnic variations in sleep patterns, anxiety, and depression as a function of the pandemic. Now, I bring that up as an example because one of the research findings that we're seeing is that ethnic minorities have tended, at least on large scale data, to be more adversely affected by the pandemic. The mortality rates tend to be higher on average. The psychological distress factors tend to be more severe on average. But one thing you will find is if you look at the data, Johns Hopkins University tracks the data. And you will see New York is one of the few states that does not separate out the data by race or ethnicity. Which, Angie, when you think about that, that's huge. Your study is answering a question that no one else is answering for New Yorkers. Does that make sense? So you might say our grouping variable, if you choose to do this, is based on self-reported racial/ethnic identification. Now, it's very important to say self-reported because you're using a survey, right? So overall, do you get an idea when you read this a little bit about what your group is doing when you read that design? Probably, right? It's pretty clear. Now, are you doing an experiment? Are you manipulating a variable?
I don't believe we are.
You are correct. You are not. So you are using a combination of methodological design of a survey method using an ex post facto design, right? We are employing a survey method and grouping our.
Okay, I found this on the web for a survey method and grouping.
I think Siri thinks that I'm talking to her. All right, and employing a survey method and grouping our participants in an ex post facto design, or design, it's fine. I actually prefer moving that to the beginning of the paragraph as well, because it basically states your overall design. Now, I don't want to focus on one group in particular because then it winds up that I'm doing their work for them. But when you read this, it makes sense, right? You're using a survey method. You're not manipulating a variable. Ex post facto, if someone is curious what that means, it means after the fact. So you didn't manipulate an independent variable, but you recognize that there could be differences that participants come into the study with, and they're called participant variables. And you're going to hear more about participant variables in lecture 10 next week. You're also probably heard briefly in lecture 4, or you read about it in lecture 4 about participant variables. But the idea is that we can analyze, just because we're not manipulating a participant variable doesn't mean that that variable is not important to study. Now, I'm going to pause here and open up for questions because I want to cover each section by itself. Are there any questions on design and what you're trying to accomplish?
How about if
So-
we don't use a survey method?
Well, what method would you be using?
I don't, I mean, when I see survey, it means that, is that like interviews and graphs and things like that, charts?
No, we talked about this in lecture 7. You're giving out questionnaires. That's what a
Okay.
survey is.
All right, thank you.
So in reality, I believe everybody in this class is going to be using some form of a survey method or not,
Okay,
right? But so any time of you're using questionnaires, that's called survey method. That's a very good question. Any other questions on that? All right, so what I'm going to do is move to the second piece of the method section. Who are your participants? That's the overarching goal. Who are your participants, right? So you have to describe that. What is the gender breakdown? Ethnic breakdown? I actually could just keep writing the categories. Ethnic, religious, if that's important to you, SES, socioeconomic status, and all other pertinent variables, factors. So, well, how would you get this information? How would you know a person's gender, ethnicity, religion, socioeconomic status, and whatnot? How would you know that?
By asking certain questions within the survey.
Way to go, right? So you have to, and I want everyone to write this down because this is critical. In addition to the instruments you're going to use to measure things like sleep patterns, anxiety, and depression, you also are going to have a questionnaire that is called a demographics questionnaire, right? So you're going to ask them, what is your age? What gender expression do you most identify with? What ethnic expression, right? So you're going to ask them a series of demographics questions, and that's to try and get a profile of your sample. Now, why do you need a profile of your sample? Because that's going to affect how you interpret your results. Let's say you do your survey and 90% of your participants are female. What does that do to the interpretive value of the survey? Anyone? Dulce, what would that do to the interpretive value of the survey? Sarah, what would that do to the interpretive value of the survey?
It would completely skew it because, if it's all female, there's no male, like opinions, there's no like gender fluid opinions, there's no binary opinions, like there's no like
Right.
other,
So that's precisely it. You might have more confidence in describing things, the experience of women, but it interferes with your ability to interpret your data for males and non-binary individuals, right? So that's the issue. So you want to look at the profile. Let's say if you, in your survey, you're studying COVID, and every one of your participants is between 18 to 25. What does that do for your interpretation for people who are in later adulthood? It limits it, right? So when you write your participant section, you're going to give a breakdown of all the relevant factors, all the pertinent factors most of the time, the common ones are age, gender, ethnicity at a minimum. But when you do this, I would say find a standard demographics questionnaire. Most demographics questionnaires are like 7 to 10 questions. It's not crazy, but it allows you to know your sampling frame. It allows you to know how well you sampled. Now, I want to prepare you that if you collect data within the college, the psychology department is about 80% female. So if you are like, well, why do I have a 2-to-1 ratio of females to males? That's not uncommon in psychology research, right? If it's important to you to make sure that you have an equal breakdown or some form of a quota sampling, right? We talked about that in lecture 7. That's something that you have to decide as a group. How are you going to even out the gender breakdown? What creative data collection ways or solicitation ways are you going to get the other information you need? That's up to you, right? When you report your participants and their age, you're going to report their mean age and standard deviation, right? So you're going to report that for age. For categories, right, where it's not a mean, you're going to report things like number or frequency. You're going to do frequency and percent. What does that mean for ethnicity, religion, socioeconomic status? They're also categorical, right? So you're going to report frequency and percent. Any questions on our participants before I move to the next section? Okay, so I'm going to move on. Now, here's a cool thing. When you're learning APA format, it's so nuanced, I have to tell you. But as of February, the new APA manual came out, and it doesn't come out every year. So it's not like there are changes all the time. But the fortunate and unfortunate thing for you as a class is that it just came out. So you may have information from a previous approach. And I'm going to teach you APA 7th edition. Now, one thing that changed in APA style are levels of heading. So for a level 3 heading now, and I'm only going to teach you the way it should be, it's bold, left align, and italicize. So let's say you were measuring depression and you wanted to describe your instrument that you're using to measure depression. And let's say we use the patient health questionnaire 9, right? So PHQ 9. That would be how you write the levels of heading, right? So notice it's left align and bold. Now you're going to need to describe the instrument, right? So you're going to want to describe the number of items, the scoring range, the if any items are reverse coded, I'll explain that in a minute. Are there subscales? I'll explain that. And then you're going to want to talk about reliability, and validity of the instrument. So that's what it should have. So you would say something that looks like this. The PHQ-9 is a 9-item measure of depression. Scores on the PHQ-9 range. And I see someone put something in the comments. Range from 0 to 27, with each item ranging from 0 to 3. All right. So now, so far, what did we do? We described the number of items. We talked about what the instrument does. It is a 9-item. We talked about the scoring range so far. Then we want to talk about, there are no scales or subscales. What are scales or subscales? Sometimes you might have an instrument that has a bunch of questions and there are different categories. For example, if you use the CISRI 24, which is a measure of spirituality, it actually has 4 different subscales. So there are 36 questions, where each of the questions tapping into either transcendental awareness, conscious state expansion, and those would be the subscales. Now, you're going to also want to cite the authors of the instrument. So it seems like the first place you would do this is when you talk about what the instrument is. And then afterwards, so we talked about scales, subscales. Reverse coding is a strategy used when you worry about people just answering from a response set, just agreeing to everything or disagreeing. You might have questions phrased in the opposite. Now, the PHQ-9 doesn't have that either, so I don't need to say anything of that nature. But there are instruments, for example, the Marlowe crown. Now, the Marlowe crown is a measure of social desirability. When you use that, some items are phrased in the positive, some items are phrased intentionally for the negative to do reverse coding. You would have to describe that. And then the final thing you want to talk about is your reliability and validity. In order for something to be considered a reliable and valid measure, it has to go through a testing process. So when you find this instrument, PHQ-9, the original instrument, it'll tell you how they validated the instrument. And the most common measure that you're going to hear them talk about is something called the Cronbach's alpha. So the PHQ, and I'm making this up, 9 had strong reliability and validity with a Cronbach's alpha ranging between 0.888 and 0.93. So now you're like, this word, I never even heard of Cronbach's alpha before this class, but that is the measure of internal consistency of an instrument. So you're going to need to tell the reader that, because if something is not internally consistent, we can't say it's a reliable measure. So at least when you're talking about the instrument, you want to tell the reader something about the Cronbach's alpha. Now, I'm going to look in the chat. It looks like I had a message. Okay, so that's not a question. It's just a statement to me. All right. So any questions on how you would write your instrument section? Okay. Well, here's the deal, people. Let's say we use the description of your design above. The dependent variables in a study are sleep patterns, anxiety, and depression. This group needs to have an instrument that measures anxiety. So this is only one instrument. So this person's going to have, and use the name of the instrument. Right now, I'm just going to write anxiety instrument. And then they're going to have a measure of sleep. And then they're going to have their demographics questionnaire. Everybody in the class will have a demographics questionnaire. Everybody, your group has to decide what demographics questions are important, and you need to describe that. Now, the instruments you use depends on the research questions your group came up with. So can I have another group share one of their research questions? Kennedy, can you share one of your research questions?
Yeah. Where it goes? Sorry. One of our research questions is, does social media cause depression or does it make the existing problems worse?
So, does social media cause depression or does it make it worse? How will you?
Oh, sorry. I found one that's probably worded better. Does social media have a positive correlation on self-esteem? Is that one a little better?
That's a much better one.
Yeah, I thought
so. You might say, is social media, you can't measure because you won't know if people had depression pre-existing. So that question needs to be changed to sound something like this. Is there a relationship between social media usage and depression? Similar to, is there a relationship between social media and self-esteem? Now, you might say, well, depression and self-esteem are related. That's true. However, it's different, right? Because self-esteem is only one, it's its own construct, and people can have greater self-esteem or a weaker self-esteem depending, and they don't have to have depression. So I believe let me just add one here. So let me say you were going to talk about the Rosenberg self-esteem scale, right? So that's just one measure. So you would have to tell me how many items, what the scoring is like, are there any reverse coding, are there any subscales and whatnot? And you're going to do it very similar to the way we did the instrument for the PHQ-9, right? Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, good. So, but you're going to do for each of them, each of your instruments, because each research question needs its own instrument, right? So if you're measuring depression, you might use the PHQ-9 as well. If you're measuring self-esteem, you need an instrument that measures self-esteem. Now, what was your third research question?
We have one here that says, how does social media affect one's goals?
How are you going to measure goals?
I'm not sure.
Right? So
Yeah.
you notice now we're getting to the nitty gritty. The question, when we talk about the design, that's where you're like, hey, wait a minute, I have this question, but I don't have a concrete operational definition. I don't know exactly how I'm going to measure or manipulate it. Either you're going to need to think about that and come up with a way to measure goals, find an instrument that's out there on accomplishing one's goals, or you might need to retool that question or change it to something else that can be measured. So that's something to think about because you're in your instrument section of the method, you're going to need that. Anyone else want to give me an example of a question for their group? Because I feel like I've covered one for a couple groups, but not all of the groups. It's an invitation. All right, well, I'm going to move on then. Any questions in general about the instrument subsection of the methods? All right, fine. So now the last part of the method section are your procedures. When we talk about procedures, this is a step-by-step description of how you completed your study. So in this context, by the way, I'm going to unbold this because I'm trying to teach you levels of heading while I'm doing it. Anything that's not bolded shouldn't be bolded in your method section. So it's a step-by-step description of how you completed your study. And before I go into what it looks like in your paper, it makes sense to give an analogy. The best analogy I can give you is it's very similar to a recipe. If there are any individuals who like to cook and they don't cook by their just natural flow, we follow recipes. So the procedure is very similar to a recipe. First, do this. Well, in a recipe, first you get out your equipment. Get out a mixing bowl. Preheat the oven to 350, right? Take a third of a cup of oil, 2 eggs, whatever. And it tells you exactly how to do it. And the same thing is said in a study. Your procedure section, you're going to tell a person exactly how to do it. Because if someone wants to reproduce your study or replicate your study, they need to know step by step how you did it. So what's the first step? First, the group uploaded research questions onto SurveyMonkey. Does anyone know what SurveyMonkey is?
Yeah,
Who said yeah?
I did.
Sarah,
Sarah.
what is SurveyMonkey?
It's like a website where you can make surveys, like with different questions and stuff. It's kind of like where you can make it on Google with like the different surveys. But I
Like
feel like
Google
SurveyMonkey is a lot better. Yeah, like Google Forms. Yeah.
Correct. So it is a data management software. So this is what SurveyMonkey is. And thank you for saying that, Sarah, because SurveyMonkey is not the only data management software there is. There's something called Qualtrics, which actually is my favorite. There's something called Google Forms, which is actually free. And you could choose to collect your data using any number of data management software. So the first thing you're going to talk about is preparing your survey. What data management software you used. Then once you create the survey, what's the next thing you likely have to do?
You have to administer it.
There it is. You have to administer the survey. So we have to talk about data collection. Describe how data was collected, right? So in this context, how are you going to collect data? Well, you might collect data using examples are SONA systems, right? Where people sign up to fill out your survey, sending links to friends and associates on social media, or face-to-face administration. Now, you look, as a group, you will plan how you're going to collect data, but notice there are different ways you could collect data. And collecting data face-to-face is different than collecting data using SurveyMonkey, right, as an example, because SurveyMonkey is a digital platform. Now, after data collection, after you get all the participants you want, what's the next thing you need to do?
You need to examine the data that you received.
Beautiful. You're on fire. Data was analyzed using SPSS, right? So you need to analyze the data, and you need to determine whether or not the research questions were statistically significant or not. But notice how it's very detailed. You talk about your data management software if possible, because maybe the interface of one data management software is different than another, and that could have changed the results, hypothetically. So you talk about that. You talk about how you collected data, because different ways to collect data might result in different responses. Posting information on your social media accounts could result in a very skewed sample, or a sample that is more technologically competent than maybe a face-to-face data collection. So you have to decide how you're going to do that. And then obviously you're going to analyze using SPSS, and then you state whichever version it is. So for the sake of this example, using SPSS 25.0. That's your procedure. Now, the whole method section is gonna be 1.5 to 2 pages. The method section, like when you read the articles, is not a long part of the paper. It's actually fairly short. It's gonna be 1.5 to 2 pages. Now, the method section comes right after the introduction. Now, for this class, you're going to submit a method section for review, but you're going to submit your method section before you're even doing data collection. So how will you be able to fill in your participants? The answer is you won't yet. You won't yet be able to until you have your final sample. So when you submit your method section, I'm aware at this point in time, it's not going to include a description of your participants. But in your final paper at the end of the term, it has to have that. And that's exactly why I'm covering it now anyway. So that in a nutshell is our method section. Does anyone have questions?
Yeah, I had a question about the instruments part. So with this part, I know you'll include the questionnaire, or how, like, what you're basically measuring. And then when you also said like the measure of sleep, demographic questionnaire, and the Rosenberg self-esteem scale, in this section with instruments, we basically list like what we're basically measuring within our survey. Like as
In let me say it a little bit differently. In the instrument section, you're telling the reader exactly how you're measuring what you're measuring.
okay.
So it's a very clear description of how you're measuring your dependent variable.
Okay.
Now, what you said actually helped me as well, because you are going to give a copy of that instrument at the end. So you're going to say, see Appendix A. And then at the end of your paper, after the references and whatnot, you're going to have an attachment of that instrument, right? So now the Rosenberg self-esteem scale, what would that be? See Appendix B. And you get the idea. Each instrument will be attached at the end of the manuscript. Now, remember what I said at the beginning of this semester. Your paper is going to be about 25 pages long. And I said, don't freak out. Well, think about how many references you have. Think about how many pages your references are. Think about how many instruments you're using. It gets very easy to get to that 25-page final paper because each section is building itself out. So it's like puzzle pieces. And right now I've covered title pages, intros, method, and reference pages. That's all we've touched so far, and then the appendices. But it's continuing to build itself out. Brittany, did that answer your question?
Yes.
Beautiful. Any other questions? All right. So I'm going to stop my share, and I'm going to also stop the recording, and I'm going to give you an assignment for each of you. All right. So